Listen, in 1978, a widowed railroad worker in Kansas named Earl Hindress ate ground beef 6 nights a week for 12 straight years. And while his neighbors in that small Great Plains town thought he was lonely, broken, or perhaps just too poor to afford a steak, his doctor eventually noted that Earl was the healthiest 72-year-old on his entire patient list. That specific rotation of simple, heavy, and unpretentious cooking is the backbone of this countdown, representing a way of life that has largely vanished from the modern American landscape. This isn't just about food. It's about the grit of the Midwest, the ingenuity of the Appalachian foothills, and the quiet dignity of men who stayed independent by mastering the cast iron skillet when the house went silent. We are talking about the kind of meals that fueled the men who built the interstate highway system, the ones who spent 40 years in the cab of a Union Pacific locomotive, and the ones who retired to a small house on a gravel road with nothing but a fixed income and a lifetime of memories. These 25 dirt-cheap ground beef meals were built for one thing: keeping a man fed, warm, and self-reliant when the world outside grew cold and the kitchen became his solitary domain. Every entry on this list is a piece of American history, from the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest to the church basement suppers of the Deep South. And today, we are honoring the granddads who didn't need a culinary degree to keep their dignity on a plate. Number 25 is the classic hamburger and rice skillet, a staple of quiet Tuesday nights for generations of men from Nebraska to Ohio. In 1985, a pound of ground beef cost about $1.19, and a box of white rice was 59 cents, meaning for less than $2, a man could secure a full 3 days of hearty suppers. The process was a ritual of efficiency. You browned the beef in a seasoned cast-iron skillet, drained most of the fat but kept enough for flavor, stirred in the dry rice and a chopped yellow onion, and then poured a single can of beef broth over the top before covering it tight. After 20 minutes on low heat, the rice drank in every drop of that salty, beefy liquid, creating a meal that asked for nothing more than a fork and a napkin. The secret, as any railroad widower would tell you, was in the leftovers. You'd reheat it in that same skillet the next morning, letting the bottom layer of rice crunch up into a golden crust that somehow tasted better than the first round. It was the ultimate one-and-done meal, a culinary anchor for men who valued a full stomach over a sink full of dirty dishes. Number 24 brings us to ground beef and cabbage, a dish where the cheapest vegetable in America met the cheapest protein, and the result was nothing short of a working-class masterpiece. This was the meal of choice for the man with arthritis in his hands or a back that ached from years of factory work, because it required no fancy knife skills and very little strength. You simply took a pound of beef, browned it well, and added half a head of cabbage chopped into rough ribbons, along with a can of diced tomatoes and a heavy shake of garlic powder. As it simmered for 25 minutes, the cabbage would collapse into silky, translucent ribbons that caught every drop of the beef fat and tomato juice, creating a savory stew that stayed in the crisper drawer for weeks without complaint. For a man living on a fixed income in rural Pennsylvania or the mountains of West Virginia, this was the definition of resourcefulness, a meal that provided bulk, warmth, and flavor for less than the price of a cup of coffee at a modern diner. Number 23 is the legendary Poor Man's Stroganoff, a mid-century American evolution of a Russian classic that traded tenderloin and white wine for ground beef and a red and white can of cream of mushroom soup. This version reached its peak in the 1970s, appearing at every VFW hall and church potluck from Maine to Oregon. A granddad would brown his beef with a diced onion, stir in that can of soup with half a can of water, and maybe a heaping spoonful of sour cream if the budget allowed that week. Poured over a steaming pile of wide egg noodles, it became a plate of comfort that tasted like a church basement supper from 1971. It was 9 minutes of work for 3 nights of food, coming in under $4 even with the bag of noodles included. For a generation of American men who never considered themselves cooks, this was the Thursday night special that kept the chill out of their bones and the hunger at bay, without ever requiring them to chop a single fresh mushroom. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a farmhouse in Iowa or a bungalow in the Rust Belt when the sun goes down and the temperature drops below freezing. A silence that usually accompanies the opening of a thinning ledger or a social security statement that doesn't quite stretch to the end of the month. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the pressure of rising costs and stagnant wages meant that for many American men, the kitchen wasn't a place for exploration, but a site of tactical survival, where every calorie had to be accounted for and every cent had to justify its existence. There was often a quiet shame associated with what people called poor food, the meals made from the bottom shelf of the pantry, or the discounted graying meat at the back of the grocery cooler. But for the granddads on this list, that shame was a luxury they couldn't afford. They knew that a man with a hot meal in his belly and a roof over his head was still a man in control of his destiny, no matter what the bankers or the weather had to say about it. They learned to ignore the pitying looks of neighbors and instead focused on the sizzle of the fat against the iron, turning scarcity into a source of stubborn, independent pride that kept them standing long after their contemporaries had moved into assisted living. Number 22 is beef hash, the ultimate Saturday morning ritual for a man whose kitchen became a sanctuary after his wife passed in 1997. This wasn't about fancy ingredients. It was about the art of the already paid-for meal. When there was leftover ground beef from 2 nights ago and half a bag of russet potatoes in the pantry, you diced those cold, boiled potatoes small and threw everything into a hot cast iron skillet with just enough oil to make it dangerous. The secret was the discipline of the spatula. You pressed that mixture flat and left it alone for 7 minutes without stirring, letting the bottom transform into a dark, golden brown crust that shattered with a fork. Flipped in sections and topped with a fried egg or a splash of hot sauce. For a man who still wanted to feel alive, this hash was dignity served at a kitchen table next to a newspaper folded to the sports page. Then there was number 21, the literal hamburger soup, a massive pot of sustenance that turned a single pound of beef into 8 full meals. By combining that beef with diced tomatoes, mixed vegetables, a lone potato, and a packet of onion soup mix, a granddad could simmer a stew so hearty it felt like an insult to call it soup. The onion soup mix was the quiet hero of the American pantry, seasoning the whole pot for 50 cents and making it taste like it had spent hours on a wood-burning stove in a Montana bunkhouse. It was math that finally made fixed-income arithmetic come out in a man's favor, especially as the potatoes broke down over 4 days, thickening the broth into a rich, velvety gravy that only got better with time. Number 20 brings us to Sloppy Joes from scratch. Not the red can from the store, but the real American version that emerged from the heart of the Midwest. You browned the beef with a diced onion and stirred in a mixture of ketchup, yellow mustard, brown sugar, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce until the whole pan turned glossy, thick, and deep mahogany. It was a meal that a 6-year-old and an 80-year-old both loved for the exact same reasons. It was sweet, tangy, and required neither strong teeth nor a steak knife. A pack of white buns cost $1, and for under $5 total, a man had lunch for an entire week, the flavor deepening every day it sat in the fridge. Following close behind at number 19 is classic American goulash, the 1962 cafeteria version that conquered kitchens from Ohio to Oregon. This had nothing to do with the old world. It was a one-pot promise of modern American efficiency, where the elbow macaroni cooked directly in the tomato sauce, absorbing every ounce of beefy flavor. It spread because canned tomato companies bought ads in magazines, but it stayed because it was the first meal a generation of men learned to make from their mothers, and the one they reached for when those mothers were gone and the house went quiet. Number 18. The beef and bean skillet was the survival strategy of a man named Raymond in San Antonio, who ate this 3 nights a week for 17 years. By dumping a pound of beef, a can of pinto beans, and diced tomatoes with green chilies into a single pan with a packet of taco seasoning, he created a base that defied boredom. He served it over white rice on Monday, over a wedge of skillet cornbread on Wednesday, and folded it into a warm flour tortilla on Friday. Same pot, 3 different lives. It cost under $4 and ensured he never felt like he was eating mostly meat, stretching the protein with the humble bean. Finally, number 17 is Texas Chili Mac, a dish that proved simplicity wasn't laziness, but survival for a man with swollen knuckles and a tired heart. It combined chili beans, tomato sauce, and macaroni in one pan, simmering under a lid until the noodles were tender and the kitchen smelled of cumin and wood smoke. Topped with a handful of shredded cheddar that melted from the residual heat, this was Sunday night football food, eaten in the soft glow of a living room television while the rest of the world hurried by. Every bite was a reminder that even on the hardest days, a man could still provide for himself with nothing but a single skillet and a single fork. In the winter of 1984, the farm ledgers across the Missouri River Valley weren't just books. They were survival maps that told a man exactly how many days of heat he had left before the propane tank ran dry or the bank started calling about the equipment loan. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes with a failing harvest or a factory layoff, a weight that settles in the small of your back and makes every trip to the grocery store feel like a tactical retreat. This was the era of cast iron discipline, where smokehouse tricks meant knowing exactly how to use flour to stretch a half-pound of meat into a meal for four, and where substitutions weren't a matter of taste, but a mechanical necessity of the American pantry. If the bread was stale, it became the binder. If the milk was turning, it became the biscuit dough. And if the grease in the pan was all you had, you made sure the potatoes drank every last drop of it. These meals weren't designed for a glossy magazine. They were built to survive the lean years of the Carter administration and the Reagan-era farm crisis, providing a high-calorie shield against the biting winds of a Kansas prairie or the damp chill of a Pennsylvania coal town. Number 16 is the beef and potato skillet, quite possibly the cheapest meal on this entire list, and a masterclass in American resourcefulness. In rural Pennsylvania, a granddad didn't need a measuring cup or a recipe card to know that 3 diced potatoes added directly to a pound of browning beef and an onion would create a mountain of food for less than $3. The secret was the cover and simmer technique, letting those potatoes sit in the closed skillet for 20 minutes until they were soft enough to crush with a fork and had soaked up every bit of the rendered beef fat. There was no broth, no sauce, and no waste, just the salt and pepper of a man who knew that the potatoes filled the gaps where loneliness and hunger tried to take root. Number 15 brings us to stuffed peppers, a dish that bends the rules by moving from the skillet to the oven, but remains anchored in the same single-pan filling logic. By mixing a pound of beef with cooked rice and tomato sauce and spooning it into the hollowed-out edible bowls of bell peppers, a man in 1964 was creating a week's worth of dinners in one afternoon. They looked like effort, and, more importantly, they tasted like the Sunday tables of a childhood spent in the suburbs of Illinois or the outskirts of Atlanta. Number 14 is the beef and noodle bake, a recipe perfected by a West Virginia bachelor named Frank Coleman in a trailer outside Beckley in 1963. Frank didn't have a cookbook, but he had a pinole group and a cast iron pan, and he discovered that by combining ground beef, egg noodles, and 2 different cans of cream of soup, he could create a casserole so rich you could almost hear the cheese crackle as it cooled. He'd wrap the squares in foil, creating a Tuesday through Friday rotation that cost him less than $2 a night. It was the church social taste without the social obligation. Then there is number 13, the one-pot beef and mac, which was the final evolution of the American macaroni and cheese obsession. By simmering dry elbows directly in a mixture of tomato soup and water with a pound of beef, a granddad was reaching back to 1890s efficiency. It was a meal that appeared when a man didn't feel like cooking but knew he needed to stay sharp. A 15-minute promise that he could still manage his own household. Number 12 is the legendary so-ses, a dish that every man who ever wore a uniform from the Korean War to Desert Storm knows by heart. In the civilian kitchens of Kentucky and Tennessee, this became the creamed beef on toast that saved many a widower when the paycheck was late. The trick was in the roux, stirring a spoonful of flour into the hot beef grease to soak it up before slowly whisking in milk until it thickened into a rich, peppery gravy. Poured over 2 slices of buttered white toast, it was a 4-night meal for under $5, a connection to a mother's kitchen or an army mess hall that provided comfort when the house went quiet. Finally, number 11 is the ground beef taco, the 1972 fixture that brought restaurant food to the American bachelor's table. With a packet of seasoning and a box of hard shells, a man could assemble a plate of 4 tacos in under 10 minutes for about $3. It was the first taste of the old El Paso era that taught a whole generation of men that they could eat like kings using nothing more than a single skillet and a sense of adventure. Listen. The history of the American dinner table is often written by the brands that sold the cans, or the magazine editors in New York. But there is a parallel record, an unwritten one, kept in the grease-stained memory of men who had to cook for themselves when the world went quiet. We credit the big names and the modern kitchens, yet we often erase the generation of men who stood over stoves in the 1970s and 80s, keeping family legacies alive in the most utilitarian ways possible. There is a deep, quiet tension between the official record of American food and the reality of a man in a trailer in West Virginia or a wood-paneled kitchen in Michigan who didn't care about garnish or presentation, only about the heat of the meal and the weight of the calories. These dishes weren't just food. They were the last remaining links to a world that was being paved over by fast food and frozen dinners, a stubborn insistence that a man could still provide for himself using nothing more than a pound of ground beef and a lifetime of common sense. For a granddad living on a fixed income, the erasure of his history was a daily threat. But as long as the blue flame of the gas stove stayed lit, he was the author of his own story. Number 9 on our list is the classic American meatloaf, a dish that was a commitment to the ritual of a real meal. For a granddad cooking alone, mixing a pound of beef with an egg, saltines, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce by hand wasn't just prep work. It was a sensory connection to every grandmother in America. The smell that filled the house as that loaf baked at 350, glazed with a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar that caramelized into a glossy, sweet tart crust, was enough to make a lonely kitchen feel occupied again. This wasn't just dinner for one night. It was the foundation for a week of retirement sandwiches on white bread with a thick slice of raw onion, a meal that cost under $6 but provided enough leftovers to make a man feel wealthy until Sunday. Following that is number 8, the Salisbury steak, which reclaimed the dignity of the 1970s TV dinner. By shaping patties into ovals and simmering them in a scratch-made onion gravy flavored with beef broth and a pat of butter, a man could recreate the vibe of a Friday night at a Tennessee Meat and Three diner for about $5. The trick was the iron skillet discipline, searing the meat but letting it finish in the sauce so it stayed tender instead of turning to leather, served over a mound of mashed potatoes that soaked up every drop of that brown gravy. Number 7 is the beef and rice stuffed cabbage skillet, a deconstructed version of the Sunday traditions brought to the Midwest by Polish and Hungarian immigrants. In cities like Cleveland or Detroit, a granddad whose mother arrived in 1951 knew the flavor by heart, but he didn't have the time or the hands for the labor-intensive wrapping of individual leaves. Instead, he'd chop the cabbage into ribbons and layer it in a Dutch oven with beef and rice meatballs, tomato soup, and a can of tomato sauce. 90 minutes later, the whole house smelled like a church luncheon, and he had a pan of food that reheated beautifully for 4 straight days, the flavors deepening every time it hit the heat. Then we have number 6, the Johnny Marzetti casserole, the legendary dish that conquered school cafeterias in Ohio and Michigan before spreading through church recipe cards across the country. Named after the husband of a Columbus restaurant owner, this mix of ground beef, egg noodles, and a red and white combination of tomato and mushroom soups became the default potluck king because it fed a crowd for under $10. For a man alone, a pan of Marzetti was a 6-night promise of safety, portions scooped into margarine containers and frozen like a library of comfort. Number 5 is the hobo dinner, a relic of the American road that moved from the campfire to the kitchen as a bachelor's best-kept secret. By wrapping a beef patty, sliced potatoes, carrots, and onions in a square of heavy aluminum foil and baking it at 400 degrees, a man could produce a perfectly steamed, juicy meal with exactly 0 dishes to wash. You ate straight out of the foil and threw the plate in the trash, a 0 cleanup victory for the man who valued his time as much as his budget. Finally, number 4 is the quintessential pot of chili, the Depression-era pot of brown that granddads across the country still swear by. With 2 cans of beans, 2 cans of tomatoes, and a pound of beef, a $5 pot became 5 different meals: a chili dog on Tuesday, a stuffed baked potato on Wednesday, and a Frito pie on Thursday. It was the most valuable object in the kitchen, a simmering proof of American resourcefulness that ensured no man ever had to go to bed hungry. The final stretch of this journey through the American kitchen brings us to the meals that didn't just fill stomachs, but acted as anchors for the soul when the rest of the world felt like it was drifting away. There is a weight to these final 3 entries that goes beyond the price of the meat or the cost of the flour, reaching back into the shared memory of a nation that was built on the backs of men who knew how to make do with what they had. These are the meals that appeared on the table when the weather turned mean in the Appalachian foothills, or when the winter nights in the Pacific Northwest seemed to stretch on forever. proving that a man with a heavy skillet and a warm stove is never truly at the mercy of the world. We are looking at the ultimate payoff for a lifetime of hard work and quiet observation. The dishes that kept a generation of granddads standing tall in their own homes, proving that a man who can still cook for himself is a man who still belongs to himself. Number 3 is ground beef and gravy over biscuits, a Saturday morning ritual that often carried through to Saturday supper in the coal mining towns of Kentucky and the hollows of West Virginia. For a granddad who remembered his mother making this as his father headed out for a shift underground, the act of browning a pound of beef and stirring in a spoonful of flour to soak up the grease was a form of ancestral prayer. By slowly pouring in milk and seasoning it with a generous amount of black pepper, he created a rich, creamy gravy that turned a $2 tube of refrigerator biscuits into a feast fit for a king. It was a connection to the past that cost almost nothing, a meal that remembered what people had forgotten about the simple necessity of starch and salt. It wasn't just breakfast, it was the fuel for a man who still had a yard to mow or a porch to fix. A high-calorie shield that lasted until the sun went down and the house went quiet once more. Number 2 is ground beef noodle soup, a pot of medicine and supper rolled into one that fed a man for 4 days straight without losing a bit of its heart. The secret to this American classic was the humble bouillon cube, a tiny square of concentrated flavor that turned 8 cups of water into a rich, dark broth in 90 seconds flat. By adding a pound of browned beef, a can of diced tomatoes, and a bag of frozen mixed vegetables that cost less than $1, a man in a quiet house in Michigan or Maine could create a soup so hearty it felt like an insult to call it a snack. This was the soup a man reached for when he had the flu and no one to bring him tea, or when he was just too tired from 78 years of living to bother with a knife and fork. It was a one-pot miracle that stayed hot on the stove, warming the kitchen and the spirit with the smell of home-cooked reality and the promise that the pantry was never truly empty. Finally, the number 1 dirt-cheap ground beef meal that granddads living alone swear by is the shepherd's pie skillet, the ultimate symbol of American independence and dignity. This wasn't the fancy version from a gastropub. This was a single cast-iron skillet filled with browned beef, onions, and a can of peas and carrots, all topped with a thick, smooth layer of prepared instant mashed potatoes. By sliding the whole skillet under the broiler for 5 minutes until the top turned golden brown with those perfect crispy edges, a man was making a statement to himself and his neighbors. It was a complete meal, protein, vegetable, and starch, that cost about $4 and fed him for 3 days. And it looked like something worth sitting down for. It looked like the dinner his wife would have made in 1964. And as he sat there, at 79 years old, with a glass of iced tea and the evening news on low, he knew he was still running his own life. This was the culmination of everything we've talked about. Not just survival food, but dignity food. It's important to be honest and acknowledge that a single list like this can only ever compress decades of history and millions of individual stories into a few moments of narration. These 25 meals represent a tiny fraction of the resourcefulness found in every small-town kitchen and bachelor's apartment from sea to shining sea. And each one of them was born from a specific moment of need or a shared tradition that we are only just beginning to catalog. The senior citizens who stay in their own houses the longest aren't the ones eating pre-portioned, pre-plated frozen dinners. They're the ones who still know how to brown a pound of beef and keep a cast-iron skillet on the stove like a monument to their own capability. Picking just one of these to make this week, whether it's the goulash, the hobo dinner, or the shepherd's pie, is a way to honor that grit and keep those memories alive in your own kitchen. Tell me in the comments which one of these 25 is going into your skillet tonight.